All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Fall 2018 Michigan Voter Protection webinar put on by Advancement Project. My name is Andrew Hairston. I'm a staff attorney in Advancement Project's national office. I'm honored to be your host for this series. Before I get into the substance of the presentation, I'd like to give a shout out to our collaborative of organizations that we've been working on this series with. In addition to Advancement Project, we have the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum, DEMOS, Faith in Action, the NAACP, the National Congress of American Indians, the National Urban League, Race Forward, and Unidos US. We are 9 leading racial justice organizations, and we're funded in part by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which made this webinar series possible. So we'll get started. A little bit more about Advancement Project. We are a national racial justice organization that uses legal, organizing, and communications tools to build power in communities of color across the country, all with the goal of eliminating structural racism in the United States. And certainly for more information about Advancement Project, I urge you to visit our website, advancementproject.org. In addition to several other program areas, Advancement Project houses a Power and Democracy program, of which I'm a member, that focuses on increasing access to the polls for Black and Brown communities and ensuring that folks have an opportunity to equally and justly participate in American democracy. Again, my name is Andrew Hairston. I'm a staff attorney at Advancement Project's national office. I'm only licensed to practice law in Louisiana, but this PowerPoint was reviewed by a Michigan barred attorney for general accuracy. And I also like to give a shout out to my supervising attorney, Danita Judge. Why do we vote? A pressing question that has been on our minds for this political moment in which we find ourselves and previous eras of American history, particularly for people of color, for Black and Brown communities in this country, as we have faced efforts to suppress our voice at the polls or participate in American democracy. Why we vote translates to an avenue for dignity and self-determination, voting to correct the ills of the past and to build the society of the future that we want for ourselves and for generations yet to come. And this is a question that I urge you to keep in mind as this presentation progresses. So I wanted to highlight a quote from a case that was decided after the Civil War in what's called the Reconstruction era of American history. After the Civil War, there were gains made by African Americans and Black people in the areas of political participation and civic engagement. But there also was a significant backlash to those efforts and to the participation that was demonstrated by Black and Brown communities. Now, this backlash may have come up because of a quote that was expressed in this case, Yikwo versus Hopkins. And it says that voting is regarded as a fundamental right, a fundamental political right, because it is preservative of all rights. And that really speaks to how we view voting here at the Advancement Project and how other communities and organizations have viewed the right. It bears on so many issues, ranging from education to housing policy to employment opportunities. And really, as I alluded to earlier, allows communities to shape the societies that they want to see and live in. And why we vote also for those who unfortunately will never have a voice, particularly a young girl who was killed 8 years ago in Detroit during a police raid, Ayanna Monet Stanley Jones. And so many victims of police terror and racial terror in this country and ensuring that her legacy, though she lived a short life, continues on through the efforts that we make and the fights that we take on. So after years of discrimination, right, in the Reconstruction era that I mentioned, there were more obvious forms of voter suppression, like grandfather clauses and poll taxes to keep Black and brown people away from the polls. There was really a watershed moment that occurred in 1965 with the signing of the Voting Rights Act by President Lyndon Johnson. And this act really memorialized a lot of the efforts of activists during the civil rights movement and enshrined protections in federal law to ensure that Black and brown people could access the polls without intimidation or fear, as in previous eras of American history. Now, although this watershed moment occurred 53 years after its signing, we are seeing, again, backlash quite similar to what occurred during the Reconstruction era, in that voter suppression laws are popping up. In this era, in this current moment, there was a decision made and announced by the United States Supreme Court called Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 that essentially eliminated what's called the pre-clearance formula of the Voting Rights Act. So states that had histories of racial discrimination in election administration, particularly in the South, before this pre-clearance formula was struck down, had to submit certain changes to their voting laws to the federal government for approval before they could go into effect. And with the lack of this pre-clearance formula now, we are seeing various laws pop up in states across the country, from strict voter ID laws to the elimination of early voting and same-day registration, all things that are immensely beneficial to Black and brown folks as we seek to exercise the right to vote. So with all of that historical context in mind, we'll get into the heart of the presentation, the mechanics of registering to vote in Michigan and ensuring that you are able to participate in the upcoming November 2018 election. And so we'll get into some of those requirements. A few baseline requirements for voting in Michigan. A voter has to be 18 years old, has to be a resident of Michigan, and has to be a U.S. citizen. There's also a requirement in Michigan law that a voter must be a resident of the city or township where you're applying to register to vote. There are several ways to register to vote. The first is an online registration application that can be found on the Michigan Secretary of State's website at this link. It also can be done by mail, sending in an application to a Secretary of State's branch office or a county clerk's office. Now, it is important to note in Michigan, when you register to vote and you go to vote, the same address must be used for voter registration and driver's license purposes. And we'll get into it fairly soon, but that address also needs to match the voter ID that you use when you go to the polls. And if one is mailing in the application, the voter is mailing in the application, and they've never voted, there needs to be some photocopy of either the person's driver license or state-issued ID or a utility bill that accompanies the application. A few deadlines to keep in mind for the upcoming November election. So the deadline to register to vote in Michigan is 30 days prior to the election, which translates to October 9th, 2018 for the November 2018 election. And just a process point, as alluded to on the earlier slide, once a Michigan voter does register to vote and sends in the application, the county clerk will mail a voter information card to the voter, and that information card will provide information on the voter's polling place, where you'll actually go on November 6th to cast your ballot. So, voter registration drives have traditionally been encouraged by the Office of the Michigan Secretary of State. During these drives, volunteers can use the mail-in voter registration form that was mentioned to register people to vote and ensure that democracy is as robust as it can be in Michigan during these elections. Now, voter registration verification. Once you do receive your voter information card in the mail, you can go online as well to check your registration status at the link included on this slide. And you can also reach out to your local county clerk, the local election official who administers elections in your county, by going to the clerk search application of the Michigan Secretary of State's website. So it might be the case that voters move within a city or town before election day. And so if one moves within a city or township before election day, they must change the address. This process can be completed online at expressos.com. Now, as a reminder, Michigan voters must have the same residential address for both voter registration and driver's license purposes. And then there also might be voters who move to another city or township before election day. If you do move to another city or township, voters must re-register, and that process can be completed online at the Michigan Secretary of State's website. And again, that reminder that a residential address must match on the voter registration application and the driver's license. Now, on to election day. All of that information certainly leads up to the actual day of November 6th, but we certainly want to highlight what the process of the election day will look like for Michigan voters. So there are forms of ID that are valid and they're required to vote in Michigan. They range from a Michigan driver's license to a state-issued personal ID card. Also, federal-issued documents such as a U.S. passport or military identification can be used to provide voter identification, as well as student ID. Now, the address on the preferred form of voter ID should match the address on the voter registration card, and that's something to keep in mind as you prepare to vote in person. There are a few other valid forms of voter ID, ranging from state identification cards that are in place of IDs, certainly if it would be a burden to get a driver's license. And then that state ID card can be purchased for $10 at a branch office. It's important to note that this ID fee requirement can be waived for elderly folks, folks with disabilities, and those who show good cause. So it's not a set in stone fee. Now, for college students who want to vote in Michigan, this is a possibility. College students can vote in Michigan as long as they confirm their residence in Michigan, stated another way, use their campus address or the address that they use for correspondence from the college to register to vote. And again, student IDs can be used in Michigan as a form of ID when you go to vote in person. All right, a few election day hours and procedures. So the polls will be open for 13 hours on election day from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. If you are waiting in line at 8 p.m., you should be allowed to vote, and you should be given the opportunity to cast your ballot. Michigan does not have early voting. It will have to can either be done in person or by absentee ballot, which we'll get into. And then political activities are generally prohibited within 100 feet of the entrance to a polling place. So any buttons of candidates or advocacy on behalf of an issue, either way, is generally not permitted within a certain amount of space leading up to the polling place. And there usually will be a marker to indicate where that 100 feet line is. And then you can find your polling place by checking out the following website at this link. Now, Michiganders who need assistance with voting at the polls can access it. Generally, ballot marking devices are available for all voters with special accommodations, and voters can make their selections using a touchscreen device. Usually that will be Americans with Disabilities Act ADA compliant. And you can check, based on the county in which you live, on county-specific voting assistance equipment at this link. So it's also important to note that language access is enshrined into the Voting Rights Act, which was mentioned earlier, particularly Section 203. And this section requires election officials to provide language assistance under certain circumstances. In Michigan, this manifests in a couple of ways. So Section 203 requires Colfax Township in Benzie County and Fenville City in Allegheny County to provide Spanish language assistance to voters. And Hamtramck City in Wayne County is required to provide Bengali language assistance to voters. So I mentioned earlier absentee ballots, either referred to by the name voting by mail or absentee ballots. To vote by mail in Michigan, and this is an option ahead of the election, one must be 60 years of age or older, unable to vote without assistance at the polls, planning to be out of town on election day for whatever reason, in jail awaiting a trial, or unable to vote in person for religious reasons, and also have been perhaps appointed as an election inspector in a precinct outside of one's precinct. And precinct means the local area where you go to vote. So these signed absentee ballots, if you meet one of those requirements, must be returned by 8 p.m. on election day, by the time that the polls close. And the signature on the ballot must match the one on your voter registration application. Now, what happens if you're challenged at the polls? Now, even if a Michigan voter doesn't have an approved form of voter ID, that person should still be allowed to cast what's called a provisional or temporary ballot. And with the proper documentation, these provisional ballots should be counted as regular ones. So let's get into the weeds a little bit more of that. Michigan allows people to challenge voters who they have good cause to believe are not eligible to vote in a precinct. So it might be a situation in which another voter says that for whatever reason they believe on information and belief that a person is not permitted to vote. Now, if this challenge is directed toward you or someone near you, it's important to know that that person, the challenged voter, will have to take an oath to vote. And an election inspector will present a specially prepared ballot to the challenged voter. And under the law, the challenged voter will be permitted to cast it. So a little bit more information on provisional ballots. If you are required to do this to vote by provisional ballot because you didn't have a valid ID, you don't have to provide any additional evidence of your eligibility. The election inspector and the county clerk will check your provisional ballot and the information on it with their records. And once it checks out, it will translate into a regular ballot. However, you will have to fill out what's called an affidavit, perhaps a signed document confirming your belief that you are registered to vote. So this idea of a precinct inspector has come up throughout the presentation, and these positions are certainly available to Michiganders. Precinct inspectors need to be registered voters in their paid positions on election day. The local clerk or clerks throughout the state of Michigan establish the training requirements for precinct inspectors within their districts. And precinct inspectors really play a critical role in ensuring fair election administration. So since it is so localized and the county clerk makes the rules for each county, we certainly urge you to check out more information at this link on becoming a precinct inspector in your county. So there is a fine line between challenge to a voter and intimidation that a voter might experience, either leading up to the election or on election day. And these forms of voter intimidation can take a couple of different iterations. Shouting at or directing abusive language toward a voter can be considered voter intimidation. Repeatedly asking about a person's citizenship status, someone lying about being an election official and deliberately spreading misinformation about voting requirements, someone bringing a gun to a polling place and certainly brandishing it or showing it, and then misleading posts on social media. So maybe saying on Twitter or Facebook, somebody say that voters of this party vote on this day, and then voters of another party vote on another day leading up to the election. All can be forms of voter intimidation. And then it's also important to keep in mind that you might see police officers at your precinct or at your polling place when you go to vote. Their presence should not hinder your ability to participate in the election, and if there is any type of intimidating action that goes on, we urge you to record it in the following ways. So a few things to do: perhaps take notes if one sees suspicious behavior or someone being overtly intimidating. You can also capture that information with a picture, or if it's on social media, take a screenshot of the false post. Then you can report the activity to precinct inspectors and the county clerk. You can also check out the election protection outline, of which Advancement Project is a member. You can visit 866-OUR-VOTE or call 866-687-8683 to report any form of intimidation that you might encounter. And then you can consult with local advocacy organizations to determine next steps and what might come. So there are a few ways to strategically engage ahead of the election. One, you can aim to meet with your local board of elections or your county clerk at least 45 days prior to the election. And you can keep a particular mind in that meeting toward voter purges and monitoring them. There is a federal law that was signed 3 decades ago into law called the National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, that prohibits election officials from conducting what we call mass purges within 90 days of the federal general election. And we are certainly within that 90-day period. So also to keep in mind, encouraging community members to sign up to become precinct inspectors can be a really good strategic tool for ensuring fair election administration. Now, there was a case recently decided by the Supreme Court in the last term concerning the MVRA called Husted versus A. Philip Randolph Institute that concerned the MVRA and its application in Ohio. And although the Supreme Court decided the case in favor of the Ohio Secretary of State, it concerned voter inactivity as a trigger for removing someone from the voter rolls. And under the process that was at issue in the case, 6 years would have had to have passed for this voter inactivity to translate into somebody being removed from the rolls. So although Husted was decided, it's important to keep in mind that the MVRA's protections largely remain in place. So a few final steps and concluding thoughts as you prepare for Election Day in Michigan. Certainly questions to ask when meeting with your local county clerk. Have you closed or consolidated any polling places? Can be an initial question. And where are those polling places located if they have been consolidated or closed? And how did the county clerk notify voters of these polling place closings? Another line of questioning, what are some of the common problems observed when processing voter registration applications? What happens if the registrant's information does not match the information in the state or federal database that's used to verify identity? Under what circumstances will voters be removed from the voting rolls in advance of the November election? And how will voters be notified of emergency polling place changes that occur on Election Day? A few other thoughts and questions to keep in mind. How are voter registration applications processed, if mailed before but received after the deadline? How do you respond to precinct inspectors and or challengers in the polling place who insist on improperly challenging voters? Again, that thin line between challenging a voter and then intimidating them and repeatedly asking about, let's say, citizenship status. And then if one observes problems at the polls on Election Day, is there a direct number that can be used to reach the county clerk to report those issues? Now, at this point, we wanted to open up the space for questions. There is one thing I wanted to note. So there was mention to absentee voting by folks in jail who have not yet been formally convicted of any crime. And that's an important piece in Michigan, that there is the ability to vote while in jail awaiting trial. And then also, once a person is released from physical custody, there is a possibility of registering to vote and going ahead and moving forward as soon as your prison sentence is over with registering to vote and participating in democracy. All right. Well, we just want to thank you so much. And certainly if any follow-up questions do come up, we urge you to reach out to us. I can be reached at my email address, ahairston@advancementproject.org. Also can be reached at the office, 202-728-9557. And you can also follow us on social media, ADV_project, particularly on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, for efforts that we'll be undertaking ahead of the November 2018 election and our broader voter protection efforts. You can also visit nationalrighttovote.org for more information on some of our specific Power and Democracy program initiatives. And just one more reminder and disclaimer that this presentation was intended just to provide general advice and not legal advice. It was reviewed by a Michigan licensed attorney, but is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship. We thank you so much for joining, and we wish you all the best as you take on the fall 2018 election.